The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. As Jesus was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a sizable crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind man, the son of Timaeus, sat by the roadside begging. On hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have pity on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he kept calling out all the more, "Son of David, have pity on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, get up, Jesus is calling you." He threw aside his cloak, sprang up, and came to Jesus. Jesus said to him in reply, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man replied to him, "Master, I want to see." Jesus told him, "Go your way. Your faith has saved you." And immediately he received his sight and followed him on the way. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. I must have been about 4 or 5 years old. And I was sitting at the table one night with my parents, and they were chatting about seemingly innocuous things, various extended family business. And somehow, one of my aunts came up, and my mother made an offhanded comment about how ugly this aunt's hats were. Auntie, and this was back in the days when women used to wear hats more often, but she was a little bit proud of her hats. Not everyone else was. So about a week and a half later, we are out at this aunt's house, big family gathering, aunts, uncles, cousins, and mostly the adults are sitting around in a room, and there's a few kids like me hovering on the edge, and Auntie brings out her latest hat and shows it around, and my mother says, "Oh, such a lovely hat." And what does precocious little Jimmy do but say, "Well, Mommy, last week when we were sitting around the kitchen table, you said Auntie's hats were all ugly." Well, if you want a recipe for making a room go utterly silent, for causing your mother to look at you like daggers are coming out of her eyes, there you go. It's in the nature of children to ask embarrassing questions and make awkward comments, probably because they see things and see truth with such utter clarity. Jesus in the Gospels encounters a lot of people in situations that could come under the general label of awkward. And oftentimes, as in today's Gospel, the surrounding crowd does some variant of shush, or you shouldn't say that, or you're bothering the rabbi. Yes, that's what this crowd does at first today, too. But Jesus seems to delight in these encounters. We see both his wisdom and his humanity emerge in them. It doesn't matter whether an adulteress has been brought before him, whether he encounters a tax collector, whether it's a leper or a lame person or a blind man or someone who's just lacking in social skills and rushing up to him at an inopportune moment. Jesus delights in those awkward encounters, as he does with the blind man here today. It's an interesting story on many levels. Usually people focus upon the fact of blindness and the metaphorical uses of blindness as opposed to ourselves, seeing ourselves in that blind man and thinking about what is it that we are blind to, how is it that we do not perceive the ways in which we are sinners and need to grow closer to the Lord, but that isn't what jumped out at me. What really struck me with this gospel reading was the line about how the blind man sprang up. Unless his house is on fire, have you ever seen a blind man spring up? And the blind man threw aside his cloak. Now, what do you think the odds are that a blind man is going to easily recover a cloak or any object that he has tossed away in a crowd? And yet that's what he did. He threw it aside because this man recognized Jesus. He may not have seen Jesus, but when Jesus came, the blind man called out, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me." This blind man knew who he was. And beyond knowing who he was, he also realized that when Jesus said, "Come to me," that running toward Jesus was the only thing that mattered. That Jesus would give him what he needed, that he would heal him in whatever way he cared to, but all he needed was Jesus. He no longer needed that cloak. And what strikes me in the person of Bartimaeus isn't just his blindness, but that childlike quality of trust, of complete, utter, simple, clear faith and trust in Jesus, the way that a child would place such trust and faith in a parent. And in looking at how this adult responds, I think we can perceive what Jesus means when he tells adults in other parts of the Gospels to be like the little children, to be like those who come unto me, as Bartimaeus went to him in this story. In contrast, and I think in deliberate contrast, to the story of the rich young man a couple of weeks ago who was told that all he needed to do for his salvation was to give up his possessions, and instead of running toward Jesus, he ran away from Jesus. Today's story is about a man who had less, but tossed it all aside, knowing that Jesus would give him what he needed. And it wasn't just sight. When the blind man went to Jesus, he was welcomed as a friend, as a disciple, as a child of God. And what we all need, what he needed, and what we can perceive in this story of apparent blindness is that it is his kind of trust, his kind of complete and utter faith and willingness to place that in the hands of God that is the means of salvation for us all.